What's up, Dave?
Hey, yeah, how are you?
Good, very good. How about yourself?
Yeah, very good, thanks. Looking forward to flying out to Amsterdam tomorrow for DuckCon 6.
Oh,
Yeah, I wish you could be there, it'd be cool.
yeah. I wish I could be there too. What's DuckCon, by the way? Just for the
So,
audience.
yeah, so DuckDB, and so if you don't know what DuckDB is, it's kind of like SQLite, but for OLAP is the way I describe that. So, an in-process query engine that's open source and free to use however you want. And so it's had developed a really big following. GitHub stars going like, that's asymptotic GitHub stars. And yeah, there's a really popular conference tomorrow in Amsterdam. So I'm flying out tomorrow morning. Yeah,
Should
looking
be
forward to
fun.
it.
Nice. Yeah. That's where DuckDB is based out of. Is Amsterdam, and should be a lot of fun. Yeah. Definitely wish I could have attended. I think last time we hung out was actually you, me, and Hannes from DuckDB fame. So we're in
Yeah, and
Paris, I
Blef
believe.
as well, right? And Blef's coming tomorrow as
Oh,
well.
Blef, dope. Yeah, he's a good dude. Yeah, awesome. Well, I think to switch gears for people who don't know who you are, do you want to give a quick intro?
Yeah, so I'm David. I've worked in data for 15 years, roughly. Most of that time has been either like what you'd call a practitioner. It's someone who actually does data work. I've worked in most industries. I haven't worked as a consultant before, like consultancy. That's probably the one sphere that I probably haven't touched in terms of workplaces. I've worked in quite a few different industries from like e-commerce, grocery, fintech, payments, yeah, a few others. But yeah, so worked as IC for a while, then started building teams. Like this is long before the idea of like being a staff engineer anywhere
Mm,
existed. Actually, long before the term data engineer was like bandied around.
yeah.
Yeah, it was only like after I'd built my first team that people started talking about data engineers and data scientists and stuff like
Around
that.
when was that?
I want to say 2014 or something like that in the UK.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems about the time that that was becoming a thing. And then what are you doing these days?
So yeah, in the last 3 years, I've been a founder or just working at different startups. So I founder journey started at Avora, where I was building a root cause analysis and anomaly detection tool that was spun out of an existing company that a friend of mine had founded. And so I kind of joined as his co-founder to try and raise money and to make that into its own business. And weren't successful, but that was a really good learning experience. Actually, like I call it like my 3 month masters in how to be a.
Yeah.
And from there, I joined Metaplane, like, our good friends, common friends at Metaplane, stayed there for a bit. And then I had this opportunity to found Delphi with my co founder, Michael Evan. And so Michael had built this prototype of Delphi, and what it was a way to interact with semantic layers using LLMs and therefore to provide like much more reliable answers. And so we turned that into a business. We've raised around. Um, but towards the end of our time at Delphi, we realized we would need to end up building a full BI tool in order to sell this effectively, and we ended up always bundling Cube with it whenever we were trying to do a POC or sell it. And so we started asking, and we asked Cube first and foremost, whether they'd be interested in us joining. And yeah, they were. They had to close their round, which they were doing. They were in the process of doing when we asked, and then after that, they were like, "Yeah, come join." That's the story of how I ended up at Cube. And yeah, at Cube, I'm now VP of AI, which is more or less a product role focused on building our AI features for either data engineers or data consumers.
hmm That seems to be have been the big shift, I suppose, since you started your startup journey. Was everything went from being data tooling to AI tooling?
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
That's interesting. I guess kind of stepping back, like you work as a practitioner. What are some of the themes that still carry through from your days as a practitioner to today?
Yeah, and I think if you think about the first phase of being a practitioner and why I think that was so accelerated, was because I very quickly ended up. I spent like a couple of years just learning the technical skills and applying them. And I was lucky to work in places which were like undergoing like fast growth and that there was a lot less, there were fewer people to do things. I did more things and there was much more appetite for risk than at a larger company. So I got to try out lots of things. And so a lot of what you'd call a lot of what I did then you'd call data or analytics engineering now. So building pipelines,
Yeah.
transformation, stored procedures, all this kind of stuff. This is all like pre-DBT, pre-cloud data warehouse time. And then what happened was I realized I wanted to be more commercial with what I did with data. I didn't want to leave data. I wanted to just do things that drove value for a business. So where I was at that time was a company called WorldPay, which has been
Oh yeah.
acquired a couple of times. So it got acquired by Vantiv, got acquired by after IPO. Sorry, I was there when it IPO'd. Then it got acquired by Vantiv after I left. It got acquired by FIS, and now it's being spun back out again as its own independent company.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, I missed that journey, but from the sounds of things, it's not. I didn't miss too much.
I think I have some other friends that used to. I think was Ian Blunden and a few that crew were at WorldPay as well, from what I recall. Right.
Yeah, that's where I met Chris Tabbs, like another
Oh,
good
nice.
friend of ours. Yeah, so Chris was like part of a project team there, and like I remember trying to learn things about what's going on, and like he was the only one who had any ERDs or any understanding of the data model. So we just ended up, and this was like he'd just give me these giant like pieces of paper with the ERD.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Yeah, so because I wanted to become more commercial with data, I ended up in a pricing team. Now, it was very much close to the data team, that pricing team, but really all we did was build a simple data model, look after that data model, and then apply it to our payments customers to understand profitability, make regressions and things like that to understand where customers were well priced or not. And then because of that, we then could make pricing policy and say, well, based on these regressions, we think these types of customers should be, and we use two dimensions for this policy, like industry and size of customer essentially. And based on that, we decided the pricing policy for that group. And therefore we were able to then run campaigns to bring companies that weren't aligned with that pricing policy in line. And that resulted in millions of dollars of extra profit, like just actual pure profit, because there was no change in operating costs for the business. So I ended up having financial targets, which is quite rare for like a data person. So I had financial targets for 3 years when I was
Oh,
at the
interesting.
end of my time there. Yeah.
What did that look like?
It was just like it was kind of like if you think about it from like a sports analogy, I'd call it like assists. Like I had a target for assists to the
Mm.
commercial team because the commercial team would own the revenue, right? That's theirs. But then it was our job to help them find more, and so I'd have to propose price changes and pricing campaigns
Mm.
that would generate that much extra revenue. And so like, it was really good because commercial team would hit their target, so then they would be keen to accept the help. Whereas if we had stolen some of their target and made it harder for them to hit it, they wouldn't they would never have wanted to work with us. So it was a
Oh,
really
of course
good
not.
way of working together.
That's interesting. That's a really good example because I mean, I think in our circles, especially, there's always this question of how much value do data people bring, and I think this is a really good example of being embedded in a team and being sort of the assist, as you say, and then it's the values. Well, should be pretty evident.
Yeah, and we just ended up having these really close relationships with different parts of that commercial team where usually the parts where they had, worse pricing and many more customers, so they could afford to take, a more data focused approach and say, okay, we're going to reprice these few hundred customers according to the policy. If we lose 25% of them, we still make money. So let's do it. And so like we could have those kinds of conversations with those. And like we'd end up being like really, really close to those commercial teams. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. Why is it important?
Because I think if you don't have that relationship with them, it's really hard you have to move much more slowly. So like
Yeah.
the first time we proposed it, we had to do a lot of work, a lot of presentations to kind of convince them of the logic and why it would work. The second time, after they'd enjoyed the money last year, they're like, no, let's do it. Just show me the rough numbers and let's get on with like it's like night and day the difference when you trust each other and
Hmm.
um,
And then so again, like, what are some of the kind of dragging forward, like in my experience, it feels like there's some immutables in the work that data professionals do. Do you have those in mind, or do you feel differently about that?
Yeah. So things that I think are always true. So that was one of them. Better be connected to value somehow. Secondly, I think it's really important, like prioritization. So And again, this is still connected to value, but it makes you more efficient because if you aren't just reacting to, oh, someone asked for this dashboard or someone asked for that dashboard, right? But you're actually, okay, this is the OKR. The OKR for, our main focus this year is not profit, it's growth. That's what we're trying to do, not increase profit. And then you start looking at the sub goals there, which is, oh, we need to acquire 100,000 customers. We need to have a 97% retention rate. And so you start looking at these sub components, like going down the metric tree. And then, like, once you get down to that level, you can start thinking, oh, well, okay, well, this is how I'd measure those things. And you start working with those teams who are like the actual executors, not even like a tactical level, at like an operational level. They're going to execute this strategy, and you can work with them, make sure they've got the data they need, like be consultative. I think that's so important because otherwise, if you're just reactive, you end up doing lower value work, you end up doing slower work as well.
Yeah, and slowness is definitely the kiss of death, I think, for a lot of data teams.
It's really funny actually because when I was at WorldPay, while I was going through that arc of doing really well, making like that connection with the commercial team, there was like our sister team, who was like the more of like the core data team, and they were like doing like a big Hortonworks like migration from the old data platform which I was still using, creaking, but it was still I was still using. And they were trying to do this big Hortonworks to Hadoop migration. They hired a data engineering team of like 50 people, and they were really expensive people. And by the end of the time I was at WellPay, they had spent years doing this, and in that time, cloud data warehouses had come out and kind of negated the need for the stack that they'd chosen, and
Oh
Zookeeper
boy.
people and all that stuff. And the CDO and the VP of analytics in that team, they got fired. Their project was considered a failure. They shit can sorry,
Oh, you can score against one of my show. It's fine.
yeah, they got rid of that project, and that was the end of it. And so that's the thing. Speed kills, right? You've got to go fast. You cannot afford to just take your time having some giant project that doesn't actually deliver anything in and of itself.
Yeah, especially as you point out. I mean, that was an inflection point in the market where cloud data warehousing and then the modern data stack really meant that you could get pretty nice tooling with a credit card and up and running in minutes typically. That I think also introduced its own set of problems, but it also meant that what you just described, that would have been accelerated and you can get on to solving whatever other problems you just caused for yourself.
Yeah, because I can just imagine like if they had tried that and Snowflake or something like that had been out,
Yeah,
it would have just been a straight, oh, let's just move stuff from SQL Server to Snowflake. And instead of it being a multi-year project, it would have been like a few months.
easy,
Yeah.
easy. Yeah. Although the lift and shift too, when that, I mean, if you're just lifting and shifting, then obviously you have to go back, hopefully, and refactor, unless it all works, and then you just don't refactor anything. But again, that's I think one of the other things I see teams doing is they lift and shift. Like we had one client that the private equity company bought them, and the private equity company said, you need to be in the cloud. You need to move your on-premise stuff into the cloud in 3 months or something like that. And so they did it. They just say, okay,
What was the basis? Like just because you should?
I don't know, but it's like you need to be in the cloud. When I looked at what they were doing, it's like you're going to spend so much more money in this way because it just they moved everything onto EC2 in this case, and then as you can imagine, that was pretty expensive. Just because running cloud servers versus on-prem, cloud's going to be more expensive if you're running it 24/7, especially if you're doing on-demand instances. So it's like, okay, that's the mandate. Go have fun.
Yeah.
And then extricate yourself off of whatever you just did. But it's um, you see some interesting things.
Yeah, that's the thing, like investment driven development, that kind of stuff. I've heard some strange things recently where like VCs have been saying, oh, you need to be building your software in Rust. Your company will be worth more money.
wait, wait, tell me more about this. This is very fascinating.
I think it's like, I think it's down to, I think it's driven by AI actually. I think that VCs are like worried that if companies are building software that's easily reproducible, that those companies actually aren't very valuable. And so one of the ways to make the software harder to reproduce and potentially more performant, hopefully that's consideration is to maybe not use like some of the more well used languages like I don't know Python or JavaScript and use something higher, that's more performant and a bit more difficult to develop in, like Rust or C plus plus or something like that.
You could do COBOL,
Yeah,
Prolog or something. That's interesting. I had
yeah.
not heard that,
I
but
was
that
kind of surprised by that, but that's one thing I heard.
I wonder would that get you like another multiple or two on your valuation if it's in Rust now, or
It sounds likely.
it's
Yeah,
interesting. I recall being part of startups where I swear I was hired just to be on the pitch deck for the machine learning or AI part because this is back in the mid 2010s, but often it was, yeah, well, we're doing machine learning or AI, however you want to call it. But I think at that time, like that was definitely had the potential to add several points to your valuation if you were to have a story around that. So the Rust story is fascinating because I don't know Rust. I've tried to learn it once, and I was like, unless I have a use case for this, I'm not going to
yeah,
invest the time. But I know even experienced programmers I know, like really good ones, have had trouble learning Rust.
yeah.
It's
It's
a
got some
bit of a learning curve.
strange concepts that are unique to it. I mean, there are like good examples of why that might be the case. Like you've got a lot of like famous Rust projects like Rough and things like that, where you see these like two order of magnitude like boosts from having rebuilt something like for like in Rust from Python or something like that. And I think maybe that's part of why they're thinking if you're building like a high performance like computing use case,
Hmm.
maybe switching to something that can actually deliver like higher speed, it does make the
Sure,
company more valuable, more attractive for acquisition as well. Because I guess if you can beat an incumbent's performance by a big order of magnitude, they're more likely to want to buy.
that makes sense. It was interesting when I was talking with Hannes about why he chose C++ plus plus for
Yeah, I was
DuckDB. It was
interested in that.
right. Yeah, his argument was, C++ plus plus will definitely be around. Who knows about Rust? And so I think it
Yeah,
was a pretty well reasoned argument.
yeah, it's funny though because at the same time as that, like Microsoft as a company had said like publicly, we want to stop using C++ plus plus so much and
Hmm.
C internally and move to Rust because of the memory safety issues that they've had
Yeah,
and bugs introduced.
for
And so
sure.
yeah, I was kind of surprised you're starting something new long after Rust has like become a thing. You could have, but I guess hiring must be hard, right? A lot of those
Mm,
Rust engineers are like in crypto on the absolute fortune. Are you going to be able to attract good engineers at a decent price if you're
mm.
hiring? Like, whereas the C++, it's been around for so long, there's so many engineers that you could hire.
Yeah, it's just a lot. I mean, it's taught in a lot of universities, and rightfully so. It definitely illustrates a lot of computer science topics that you should know about, like memory allocation and stuff that's thankfully hidden from you in a lot of languages. But you still.
Yeah, unfortunately, that was the first language I came across with C++, and I really didn't like it, and it kind of put me off programming for a while.
Oh, really? What didn't you like about it?
I just found it really hard to avoid compile errors and to get anything to
Mhm.
work. It was very unforgiving. Whereas, if you use something like Python, for example, it's so much more forgiving.
Yeah, it's very forgiving, almost to a fault, but it's
Yes.
definitely yeah, no pun intended, I guess. It's like fault. But yeah, it is interesting. The investment thesis is a fascinating one. That one you just mentioned with the VCs and Rust, because it's like I think I'd love your take on this because AI code generation could make anyone basically a quote Rust programmer, or at least a fairly crappy one. But you're
Yeah, that's the thing. I guess maybe it's harder, right? Because if what does Rust have? There's like borrowing of memory, that concept. Like apparently that's really easy to mess up. So I imagine that AI might struggle to build something that's efficient or
hmm
doesn't have memory problems in Rust, and that's
yeah.
where
Like it
skilled
was
engineers would
like Chris
be more.
Rickamini was telling me about that. I think he tried learning Rust like a few times, and then finally had this project with his new database, which is in Rust. But yeah, I think he was on the podcast. He was talking about how he used ChatGPT to figure out like some of the very cryptic stack trace issues that he saw. So and a lot of it was the memory stuff, like you say, and it's yeah, it's
I mean, that is one thing I've really been enjoying with AI is actually the stack trace interpretation is excellent. It's really, really good.
it's really good. Yeah, it is fascinating though. Like I was actually just writing something the other night. this code for a dev container, if you've ever used that. And it's one of those things where like I was just like, just I just need this, just write it. It was in a GitHub Copilot, and of course it writes it and it doesn't work. But it's in VS Code, right? And so you'd think that it would know like this, what I'm asking for in VS Code, and it still didn't work. So I had to go back and debug it. So like it'll generate reasonably good looking code, but there's always I found like especially stuff that I don't do that often, like dev container. I mean, I only do that a handful of times because I'm not spinning it up every day. But it's one of those things where it's like, okay, you could at least get this right. I would hope in the IDE in which you're building this, but didn't. So maybe I'm just like a really crappy prompter might also be the case. I don't know.
Yeah, and
So
the thing is, for me, I'm actually becoming a lot braver about some of the things I'm willing to try. So the other day, I started using Obsidian a bit more recently
oh,
because
yeah,
just I'm looking at this project where there's a lot more detail going on. And I just thought, well, every time I generate notes or make notes, like from like a note taker, for example, I would like it to be tagged with some of the things I'm interested in or some of the themes I'm interested in. And so it would be easy to use an LLM to do that, but they didn't have like a community plugin to do that. So I built one using Olama to effectively use an LLM to tag from a list of tags every document in my vault, and it works. And like I'd never have thought of doing that like before AI assisted development.
well, of course not. I mean, yeah, that I don't even know how Obsidian works under the hood.
The plugins are pretty simple actually; they're just JavaScript.
Okay,
Yeah,
which is its own can of worms because JavaScript it's probably one of the most ubiquitous languages everywhere. Would say it's one of the most, for me personally, it's one of the most hateful languages. I don't like JavaScript very
I
much.
didn't actually. It didn't develop it in JavaScript. It did it in TypeScript and then just like
No, dope. That's good.
and then output.
Interesting. Yeah, that's the power of it. Like I've written a lot of JavaScript in the past, and I actually a couple weeks ago I came up with this automated workflow for just some authoring stuff I was doing, and it was in Google Apps Script. If you've ever used that.
No,
So in Google Workspace, behind the scenes, you can actually write automations, but it's all in JavaScript and then the AppScript SDK. And yeah, I mean, some of this stuff, I mean, I'm pretty good at JavaScript, which I don't know if that's a good thing or not. Um, but yeah, I mean, I asked Claude, can you just help me like a bit with this? And it did a fantastic job, and it got me over the hump because it's not like I'm an expert in the, because otherwise, like you're pointing out, you have to master the SDK, you have to master a bunch of other stuff, and it's just that's a learning curve.
that's all about reading documentation and understanding it to a point where you know what boilerplate stuff to put in before you actually put your real logic in. And so that's fantastic use of AI. Yeah, someone at Cube recently had to go through the same activity because he was building integration with Google Sheets. So you need to use the same sort of thing.
Yep. Yeah, and bless Google's heart, but the app script is not. I would say like it's good, but it could be better.
Yeah,
Yeah, and that's one of those things where like definitely AI would just be like, let's just see what we can do to get this moving. So, um, that's interesting. So, talk me through Cube. Like, what is Cube?
yeah. So Cube is a universal semantic layer, and so I think it's probably worth considering what a semantic layer is. So
Mm,
in my mind, a semantic layer is an abstraction on top of a data model that allows you to just query the data model without having to write code because the abstraction abstracts entities out of the data model explicitly. So you can say, this is a customer. So you can just literally say, give me the customers without having to write select customers.id from silver.customers where type is not test and all these little things that happen when you have to write code and that result in inconsistency. And that's a really simple example. Like when you start thinking about, well, how do you define revenue and how do you define segments and all these different things
mm,
that people do on top of a data model, it gets really complicated and it gets very error prone. And that's why people, go into boardrooms and argue about whose data is right.
yeah.
So that's the essence of what a semantic layer is. Like typically they seem to support YAML. We also support JavaScript and Python, but to express the joins, you say, well, how do these tables join together? Which of the fields in the table are dimensions? How do you aggregate other fields to have measures? And that's like the basics of like what you do in there. It's all very SQL based. So I think anyone who can write SQL can work in it. It's to people who've used LookML, it's incredibly similar to that.
Yeah.
To the point where we have a script to convert LookML to cube camel.
Nice.
Yeah, so that's kind of the crux of it. Then there's a bunch of ancillary stuff on top of it, like RBAC considerations, like you can impose row and column level security very, very easily. And actually, I actually really believe that the semantic layer is a really big boost for information security, because if you're trying to secure data, if you don't really know what that data is about, it's really hard to do a good job of securing. You either take like a really heavy-handed, no one's allowed to see this data because I don't know what it is approach, or you take a laissez-faire, well, we don't know what it is, you have
Yeah.
a look, and then you put yourself at risk. Whereas if you expose data with the semantic layer and say this data is about a customer, this field is their email address, the user service should have access to that field, and no one else should. But anyone can have access to their marketing segment, right? That's the sort of thing which makes security easy and makes security able to be proactive. So I keep talking about how I think actually, even though everyone talks about semantic layers within like an analytical setting, I actually think from an infosec setting, it's like it's amazing.
Yeah.
And then like you have other benefits like so Cube has caching and pre-aggregation. So what typically has happened without a semantic layer is that in data models you have this gold layer that you've seen in the medallion architecture that lots of people refer to. The gold layer is essentially aggregations of the silver layer, which is your actual real relational data model. And so the gold layer is just making that silver layer easier to query, faster to query. That's kind of it. That's all it does. It doesn't ever add information, and often it loses information because you end up with fixed grains and loss of dimensions in those gold tables. And so what the semantic layer does is that because that gold layer becomes kind of virtualized inside the semantic layer and dynamic inside the semantic layer, you can, but at the same time, you can still end up with needing to have like more performant querying. So you
Mm.
can have pre-aggregations, which would make the equivalent of a gold layer table or gold layer star schema. And then if queries hit that pre-aggregation in the cache, great, you get like a sub-second response and no cost on your data warehouse spend. But if they miss but they still could be served by the data model, then it will generate a new query and also cache the results of that query should someone else ask the same thing. So you kind of get this great like best of both worlds of having an open data model, but also having the performance of that gold layer.
Hmm. Yeah, and it feels like that was a big evolution too. Was sort of the I guess some people call it a headless BI, but you mentioned LookML, and that was great. But it was also tied to Looker.
Yes.
So
So that's like one of the other big benefits that we often see customers enjoy is that they don't want to be tied to Looker anymore. They don't want to be tied to GCP and whatever else Google's going to do to them. Because really,
yeah,
that's how they feel. Like they felt like GCP's just done stuff to them. It's such a and what we have people at Cube who used to work at Looker. One of them used to be like the head of their department of customer love. That's literally what it was called,
yeah.
and they got rid of them because they didn't care about that anymore.
Which
Yeah.
I mean, it's talking about I used to do a lot of work with Looker back in the day as a partner and also as a fanboy, and their Department of Customer Love, I would say, was like the crown jewel of the company. Like if
Yeah,
you
I
wanted to
loved
meet,
it
they were
as a
so
Looker
good.
customer.
Yeah, yeah. And then I heard they're sacked. I was like, that is the dumbest move you guys ever did.
But it shows their interest in it. Their interest was never in it as a product. Their interest was in it as an API, which is the GCP way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it. So I'm curious to see where it goes, but I think that it definitely opened up an opportunity for uh, projects like Cube, for example. They can just come in and say, well, let's unbundle this whole thing, and
Yeah. And I really do believe that. I don't believe that the semantic layer should live within a BI tool because of that problem, right? Because whoever does it next, whether that's Omni or whoever else, you're going to end up in the same situation at some point because they will exit and then your semantic layer is owned by someone you don't want it to be owned. And there was this kind of because like your LookML repo was Git in GitHub and version controlled, it almost felt like it was yours, but it never was because you didn't have the compiler. Whereas with Cube, the compiler is open source. Anyone can run Cube themselves.
mm-hmm.
It can be, it's not necessarily trivial. Scaling up and down your cache, like your cube store workers, we call them, that's not trivial. And that's part of the value we offer with our paid offering. But
Yeah,
it's doable. Like you don't have to use Cube Cloud. And for me, that's a feature of Cube Cloud.
that's super cool. What do you think AI does to semantic layers?
So
And I should flip the question too.
yeah,
There's two questions here. Um, sorry, it looks like you're reconnecting here. There you go. I guess what does AI do to semantic layers? And I think the other part of the question is what does semantic layers do to AI?
yeah. So I think, and this is one thing I've commented on, is that lots of people out there have been saying, oh, in order to use AI, you have to get all your data engineering and ML engineering stuff right, and all the underinvestment that you've been doing has to be rectified. And I think, do you know what? That's not true for every AI use case. Like if you were like
Correct.
trying to sift through your sea of unstructured like legal documents, you don't need to fix your data engineering pipeline. Just go straight to those documents. It's much more like a software engineering like way of working. But if you want to access your OLAP like type data with AI, that's where you do need to do that, and you do need a semantic layer, because if you don't have a semantic layer between the LLM and your data, and you're just saying, LLM, generate me a SQL query based on the database schema, essentially that LLM is doing two things at once. Firstly, it's deciding what your data means. And yes, you can augment that with a knowledge graph, but it's still making a decision. I know it's not really a decision, but it's still doing that for you, which you don't really want it to do. Because actually defining what data means is something that you should do either once or not very often and then reuse over and over again. And that's perfectly good use of human and engineering time to do that in your semantic layer or whatever else you're using. And secondly, it's decided what the data means and also decided how to query it using code. Languages like SQL, you can write code in really like many, many different ways. You can write things in really complicated ways. It's nearly Turing complete. So you end up with this indecipherable code. So you end up with an answer that's really a black box. You don't know how it's decided what the data means, and you don't know what the code it's written necessarily means. And if I was looking at something like that as an analyst, I would just and people were querying the answer, I would just rewrite the code myself, knowing what that meant. And so it's not great, to be honest. I just don't see it ever succeeding, that method. And what we've seen in the industry is like I was saying that for a long time. I've been saying that for like 18 months or more now.
Yeah, you have.
And back then, at the start, people were still very hopeful about that idea of doing text to SQL. Now, pretty much everyone's coming around to. Everyone's at least at the point where they think, oh no, you must use a knowledge graph, otherwise it won't know what your data means. Everyone's got that far. They haven't got to the point where I am, which is where I think the LLM should not be writing code. It should just be asking for things, and then a deterministic system should compile that request into actual executable raw SQL to run against your data warehouse and pull the data
Hmm.
back.
Yep. That would certainly alleviate the hallucination problem.
Yes. And also it's forgivable hallucination. Like if it does come up, if it does take your question, interpret it and say, okay, you asked for, revenue by marketing channel. And it says, well, I'm going to use like the paid marketing channel. And you might say that's okay. And I'm going to give you revenue less depreciation, right? And like net revenue less depreciation. And then it's like, and it says that's what it's doing because it can do that because it's choosing from a menu of stuff. You can say as a person, no, that's not right, really what I wanted. I wanted just net revenue. And that's like a forgivable mistake. That's a mistake that any analyst could have made answering that question for you. And it's transparent. You know what it's doing. And so you can correct it and then it gets the right thing for you. Whereas when that mistake happens in the text to SQL situation, it's not possible for you to have
Mm,
that interjection, to have that transparency.
yeah. So how does so semantic layers helping AI? How does AI help semantic layers?
So yeah, this is some of the stuff I've been working on recently. So we've been calling it like loosely AI data engineer inside Cube, and
Mm,
then like lots of these like IDEs like Windsurf and Cursor named their engineer that you talk to. So I named it Shader because in the UK when you learn how to shade in art, you always get a cube, and someone says, "Oh, here's the
Mm.
light source. Shade the cube," and it kind of reminded me of cube, so we called it shader. Like that's a work in progress. I think we might change the name. But yeah, effectively, what AI can do to help the semantic layer is, firstly, like if someone doesn't have one, that cold start problem, it can help there for sure. And I've already kind of proven this. So at the end of last year, I wrote a blog series on SQL Mesh, and at the end of it, just like I said, being brave about making an Obsidian plugin, I made a pip, like a Python package to use SQL Mesh with an LLM to generate cube semantic YAML based on the models that you've got in your SQL Mesh project and whatever else is available. And I was able to do it. I was able to generate a pretty decent semantic layer, and that's good enough to start with, right? If that then suddenly works in Cube, and all you've done is give Cube some SQL or your transformation project that already exists, you get a working semantic layer. You've then got code in your Cube project which you can say, I need to add another dimension here. It seems to have missed that dimension from my table, or I need to add another metric, but I can see how it's done it. Like going from having seen how this should work on your own data to having something that's like 80% there is such a big difference, because most engineers are pretty happy to make a few adjustments to something easy. But like starting from nothing, I think is a bit daunting for some people. And I think that's why semantic layers probably aren't as adopted as they could or should be.
Mm.
Is that unfamiliarity is a problem, and so that's the first place that we, in the journey that we think AI will help people. But secondly, we're also seeing it work really well as a co-pilot, where you're just changing code in the semantic layer. Obviously, that's a well understood use of AI in tech spaces. And then the other place we're also looking at it is almost it's like a librarian. So you just ask it, or how do I do something? Or what does this mean? And it will just explain it to you using either the combination of like documents, database schema, your already existing Cube code base, whatever is available to it. And it can answer those questions. It does quite well. And finally, one thing we see is that obviously with Cube, because that YAML that describes your semantic layer is compiled, you get compilation errors. And sometimes they're not the easiest to work with. And so this is exactly what we were talking about earlier. We've built like a button. You just say, ask Shader about this compilation error, and it'll give you a fix. And so, yeah, we've been seeing people enjoy that too. So that's
Are
where I
these
see it
are these
helping.
SQL compilation errors?
No, it's actually compiling the YAML into, yeah, so that it's ready to be used by the compiler.
Interesting. How does that sometimes go wrong?
So it's just because something like they've used the wrong syntax, and there's like
Mm,
this tab sensitive as well, and things like that can go
yeah,
wrong.
that is
Maybe
the
it
downside of
named
YAML.
something.
It's
Yeah,
I'm always the idiot that sometimes like tabs and then actually puts a space there, and then I'm like, never mind.
yeah, it's easy to read and write, but it's easy to mess up as well.
Mm-hmm. That's cool. Like, where do you think things go this year and next year with AI?
Well, I think like there's a broader like macro sense, because I think until about a month ago, everyone just thought you'd have to spend an absolute fortune like to build the next like GPT-5 or whatever it might be. And now, because of what's happened with DeepSeek, that idea has been smashed. Like, people aren't sure about that anymore. And now, OpenAI are claiming that DeepSeek have used their model to train, like through distillation, to train their R1 model. Now that hasn't been proven, and honestly, until it is, my thing would be to say, is that sour grapes? Like you got beat and you don't like it? I don't know, maybe.
Yeah.
They need to substantiate that, and I think it's going to be very hard to actually provide evidence that a court would accept as evidence to prove that.
Well, especially because it's a Chinese company that did it, not an American one. So good luck.
Yeah,
Maybe do it in the international courts, but yeah.
yeah. And, actually, what was really interesting is the Anthropic team came out and talked about how they've trained Sonnet 3.5. And they've said they didn't spend that much money. They spent tens of millions of dollars to train it. Then they didn't use distillation from like some giant Opus model, because there have been rumors going around that some of the cheaper models like GPT-4 and 3.5 Sonnet, that they've been trained using a giant model for distillation and the giant model being too big to release because it would be too expensive. But there you go. You're seeing Anthropic say they didn't use that technique and they trained
Mm.
through other means, and it was relatively cheap. So I think this idea that it has to be so expensive is going to get debunked. And I think I really hope like different methods of like how to build these will come about that are more efficient. So I think we'll see that people are really interested in that now, rather than just
So
spending money.
I was at a cocktail party with I was chatting with somebody who was part of Stargate, the $500 billion investment in data centers and AI and whatnot, and they're just walking through how the energy requirements for this, and I was like, that's interesting. I mean, they're at the point where they're looking at dusting off old nuclear reactors in the states and basically trying to uncover every stone they can to get more energy. But then I turned to my friend. She's a math professor and AI expert, and I was like, "Would it seem like we might? I mean, the human brain. What got me thinking is the human brain needs 20 watts of power, right? Not that much.
No,
And like, well, we're trying to
4 million
replicate this with
parameter
how
model.
many? Yeah, we're trying to replicate this with like, God knows how much power. And maybe and I was like, well, would it be worth investing some of that money into better, maybe trying to figure out different approaches, different math to make this work? I can't say that how we've been doing it now is the only way. It just seemed like we're going to get into the self perpetuating problem of more data centers, more energy consumed. Obviously incidental things like more climate change and so forth as a result. And I'm like,
Yeah,
does this seem like it's worth it at the end of the day? Like, what are we doing? And then obviously DeepSeek happened around the same time. Like, the whole news dropped, and it's like, okay, cool. Maybe this also calms us down a bit because it just felt very. You ever had that feeling where you just kind of feel like something just seems off about the whole situation? This is one of them. I listening to this guy, I
yeah.
was like, do we really need this much power to do something that the human brain's been and other animals have been doing for ages? Like far
And I think
less
there's
more efficiently.
problems in that like, how do you think only using only language, is enough to train this model that you want to
Right.
be like a human when we're trained hugely on like spatial and image and
That's exactly
video
it.
and
Yeah.
all different kinds of inputs, and then our, like, I call them small strategic models, like our brains, are able to do a lot more with a lot fewer parameters, right? Most of those 4 million parameters are like keeping our heart pumping and stuff.
But it was just, I think it was interesting. And then part of me was just wondering, like, how much of this is like a grift to get, a lot of money. Because when there's a number like 500 billion thrown around over a few years, I mean, that's going to attract, I think, a lot of attention. And the problem with this is it also disincentivizes anybody from trying new approaches because it's just, the focus is on data centers, all the money is there. And it means that there's no incentive to try anything more efficient. It kind of reminds me of like, big energy companies and the electric car when that was still sort of a wish and a prayer back in the 80s and the 90s. The car companies would do everything they could to kill off
Yeah,
the electric car, but figured it out.
I mean, that's the thing, that we're seeing those kinds of technologies, and now, with because there's been investment, it's like anything we invest our time and attention on gets solved, right? It's just a case of that prioritization and the corruption of that prioritization that stops things. Like, all the stuff about sodium and solid state batteries and all that stuff that we're looking forward to coming out. We could have had that 10, 20 years ago if the fossil fuel lobby hadn't been so effective. But yeah, and so like, with AI, I see this happening as well. Like, I think like Facebook have been talking about large concept models, and the idea is that instead of splitting what, because tokens aren't exactly words, they're like 4 characters usually, and that's got to be harder to train on than actual full words. And so, like, I think with the large concept model, they're not going to split the words. Yes, it might make parts of the model less efficient, but it may mean you need many fewer parameters to build a powerful model. And I keep reading about like different approaches to how the forward feedback works, and I just think this is the first architecture that worked, and we're going to see many more future ones that make it more efficient. What's the thing that it's going to go down to? It's probably like, yeah, that 4 million parameters that we have. That's the thing that's going to converge down to, like, in order to get an effective model.
What a fascinating time we're in right now.
Yeah. And that's like the big macro picture. I think like on a micro level, people are talking about agents, people are talking about AI
Yeah.
applications, and I think that's where we will. I think this year we'll be seeing many more of those things happening. Where we're already seeing this, where companies are asking us, we want to build our own agent internally. So this is like, if you think about what happens inside a normal company and the number of applications and data stores and document stores that people have to use, it's insane. I would be surprised. I'm surprised that anyone finds anything.
Yeah.
And if you had one place where you could just ask a question and it will say, well, I think the answer is this, and these are the four documents in Confluence, Notion, and Google Docs that I cited to give you this answer, like that would be amazing, as a starting point. And maybe that question, it could, it has to decide what kind of question it is. Like maybe it's not just a knowledge question, maybe it's like an actual data question, and it could route to like our AI API, for example, and then give you a data answer as a result instead of, and so it kind of routes between the systems. And maybe that's like an OLTP kind of question. It's like, oh, I want you to add a record for this new customer. And it's like, oh, that's actually writing a record to the OLTP database, whether that's in Salesforce or something else. And so you can see these agent frameworks becoming quite powerful centers of knowledge and access for
Hmm.
companies. And what I think will happen is companies will probably build those agents themselves, but they won't build the applications and the plugins for those agents. I think the owners for those will probably be the applications they're using. So maybe that's Salesforce. So Salesforce will build like a plugin to use for your agent framework. Could be Cube, could be Notion, it could be anyone.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Satya Nadella said that agents will be the death of SaaS applications. So we'll see.
The thing is, I think it maybe that's true, but I think it will take a long time to happen. And I think that the SaaS applications who are willing to adapt to the new agent world
Yeah,
can do very well, because if you just make it so easy to just plug this into your agent, it's like a couple of lines of code or just like a GUI drag and drop, and then you can start asking these questions as well. Companies are going to be lazy and just do that and pay the money for the SaaS application. They don't want to use their SaaS application. They just want to access it with AI, and that's fine.
well, yeah. I mean, was it OpenAI just put in preview mode operator? If you have the
Yeah.
pro plan, you can try that out. I haven't tried it out yet. I may buck up the $200 and pay. I've been dorking out with computer use on from Claude
Is that
and
good? I haven't
Anthropic.
tried any of that actually.
It's cool. Run it in the Docker container though. Don't. I would not suggest running it on your regular machine.
Yeah.
But the Docker container version yields some pretty impressive results. And I showed it to my wife, who is not tech savvy at all. She works in finance, and I just showed her, okay, so like here's it interacting with the spreadsheet and doing stuff, and she's like, okay. Um, so, but that's that interacting with applications, right? Very curious to see what a native agent workflow looks like that sort of inverts the whole paradigm. Like, what would that be? I guess we'll find out. But the thing is, how many applications does a typical mid-sized company have? Maybe like WorldPay, for example. Where you used to work. Like, I'm curious. Like back in the day, how many apps would they have had?
And this would have been like, I think it would have been hundreds, if not thousands, but even that would have been deflated because it was that long ago. Like today, that kind of company would have way more, like 10
Yeah,
times.
yeah. I think on average, yeah. I was reading the other day, like most companies have like at least 500 SaaS apps running, right? And that's SaaS applications. Like it's almost you get subscription amnesia. Like you don't even remember how many subscriptions you have to all these SaaS apps, and so it's nuts.
Yeah.
There's a lot, but get Cube as a SaaS app
I mean, it's a bit different, right? Because it's primarily yes, it's an app, but it's also primarily an API,
yeah,
which I guess like most of those applications people are talking about being completely removed are more like human centered for the interface rather than service centered.
for sure. Yeah, I'm curious to see where this goes. The agent stuff. I mean, this is the year of AI agents. At least if you read the LinkedIn and other social medias, I think it is interesting because part of me just follows sort of the narratives we've been on for the past few years. It was like generative AI, what 2022 part of 2023. In 2023, you started hearing a bit about agents. 2024, you start hearing more. So this is a year, but it still feels like a lot of companies are still sort of stuck in the chatbot phase and trying to figure out what that means. So I'm part of me wonders, okay, like the agent frameworks, as far as I can tell, don't seem to have a lot of guardrails in terms of enterprise security and the ability to work within the confines of a business. So I'm wondering, like, if this is just a narrative that, like, big AI, as I'm not calling the industry, if it's just a narrative they're pushing on people to keep the story going. Because if you look at a lot of the workflows right now, a lot of them feel pretty half baked. Like if you were to use um,
Yeah.
LangGraph or whatever, Crew. I mean, it's good stuff. Don't get me wrong, but it's like a lot of it doesn't feel like it's ready for prime time in like a corporation
Yeah.
enterprise.
And I feel like a big part of that is security because making sure that an individual employee has access to what they should have access. And like, so like, for example, like we use Okta at Cube and lots of people use Okta. And like, if you know, and it could actually be a real benefit because if that point of access, you've gone in with Okta, right, before you can ask a question, it knows who you are, it knows which applications you should have access to and not. It knows inside those applications, like which records or which fields that you should or shouldn't have access to. And therefore, when you ask the question, and we do this in Cube already, that if someone uses our AI API, asks a question, it only answers from things they're allowed to know about from a column and row level. Like we just inherited all of Cube's like wonderful like RBAC stuff. You know, if that can happen within the agent framework, then I think it could actually be like a real booster for it because suddenly security are just like they're okay. If you want this connected to the agent, it needs to be integrated with Okta, and so everyone's actually going to finally get around to you making their app integrate with Okta. Not necessarily the providers, but the teams that just I'm just going to use single sign-on and not bother with Okta. You know that everyone's going to do it properly, make some roles and the right kinds of levels of permissions for those roles, and then you can just say, okay, well then whoever's accessing using the agent gets the right stuff, and it's safe.
Let's hope so.
So I know that's a bit idealistic.
Like, may I hope? May I just? It's trusting that the agent won't become quote smarter than to just like figure everything out and tweak the permissions. Because Anthropic had that AI alignment paper they had a couple months ago where they were able to show that the AI was sort of colluding in the back with itself to appear like it was compliant, but then just
I mean, I see that security thing as more of a deterministic feature where
yeah
as you traverse the node of like, I'm just thinking in my head, I'm seeing LangGraph, right? But which is similar to how an agent framework would work. As you traverse down the nodes and edges, like it should take the security credential for that person to the next application
yeah.
and therefore know deterministically not to do with AI what they should and shouldn't access.
Mm-hmm.
It shouldn't be down to AI to deal with that. It's just AI makes the interface nicer.
Right. Yeah. It's gonna be exciting. I'm curious to see next year if it was really the year of AI agents this year, or whether next year will be
Yeah,
the year of
see.
AI agents, or the year of DeepSeek clones, or whatever. So it
Yeah.
should be
I mean, we've
interesting.
heard that this is the year that a lot of budget comes out for AI initiatives. Like, whereas I think last year was
Mm,
more experimentation. 23 was, oh, we're interested, but we don't know what to do. And some people are putting stuff they shouldn't into ChatGPT. And then I think last year they were more seriously like, what could we do with this? And they were talking to consultants. And I'm sure you've maybe done some consulting like this. Like, what could we do with this? And then this year it's like, well, let's go and do the thing that we maybe thought we could
yeah,
do last year.
we'll have to meet back next year and have a recap on that.
Yeah.
So, well, Dave, it's been fun chatting with you. I guess for people who want to find you on the internet, how can they do that?
Yes, I'm on LinkedIn. It's just, yeah, my name is very easy to find if you just search for my surname. I'm more or less the only person on there. Same is true for BlueSky. You can also follow my blog on davidsj.substack.com. So those are like I guess the three main ways to get
Yeah,
in touch with me.
it's a great Substack too. I read it all the time.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Likewise.
yeah. Thanks. Awesome. Well, have fun at DuckCon. So we'll talk to
Will
you
do.
later.
I'll
Yeah,
be missing you there.
yeah. Say hi to everybody. All right. Take care.
Bye.